The axe edge gleamed in moonlight as it fell toward Leopold Gainsworth's throat. His cry faded in the Newfoundland wilds, devoured by winds that had swallowed such echoes before. This is the tale of how an entire mountain chain turned into a hunting ground, and why some paths should never be walked in solitude. The year 1829 carried strange warmth to the Appalachian stretches of Newfoundland, where spruce needles snapped beneath boots and the air carried the taste of iron and far-off snow. Fog clung to granite ridges like hands unwilling to release. And somewhere inside those ancient hollows, Drusilla Pembroke waited with the patience of stone itself. She had learned long ago that wanderers gave themselves away through sound before sight. The break of brittle twigs, the rasp of boot leather over rock, the strained breath of men unused to thin highland air. Leopold Gainsworth, a cartographer from St. John's, had departed the coastal hamlet of Trinity Bay on September 15th with supplies for a 3-week survey. His task was straightforward: chart the unmarked watersheds between the Avalon Peninsula and the interior highlands, recording possible routes for future timber works. What the colonial officers failed to realize was that these ridges already held a sentinel, one who considered each step an intrusion and every surveyor's stake an act of profanation. Official notes from the Newfoundland Colonial Office portrayed Gainsworth as precise and skilled in wilderness travel. His notebooks recovered months afterward revealed another picture in their last pages. September 28th. Compass points erratic, trailblazers altered or destroyed. September 30th, sense of being watched. Game tracks led to meadows that felt deliberately arranged. The truth was simpler and far more terrifying. Drusilla Pembroke had been shadowing him since his second dawn in the highlands, descended from Appalachian settlers who had drifted north during the colonial American years. Drusilla knew these ranges in ways lost to government mapmakers. Every deer track, every secret spring, every cavern that could guard a hunter through killing winters, and she knew them all. More critically, she knew how to bend them into weapons. Her cabin rested in a hollow so flawlessly hidden that smoke from her chimney dispersed through natural stone fissures, unseen from any approach a traveler might attempt. Inside, shelves stacked with preserving jars caught lantern glow, their contents floating in brine too dark to recognize. A bundle of walking sticks leaned on the far wall. Ash, hickory, pine, each etched with initials that had once belonged to men who no longer required them. But Drusilla's true craft lay deeper in the hills where she had devoted years refining her methods. A lattice of hidden pits, masked with pine branches and moss. Snares set at careful distances along the most practical camping places. Deadfalls sprung by the simplest act of gathering firewood. She had turned 20 square miles of wilderness into a vast snare meant to claim those who presumed to sketch her land. October 1st began what local officers later called the season of vanishings. Gainsworth's last entry, dated October the 2nd, bore only 4 words. "She knows I'm here." When rescue parties at last found his encampment 3 weeks later, everything sat as he had arranged. Tent still fastened, food untouched, surveying gear placed with military neatness. Only the man was missing, along with his firearm and a lone cooking pot. The leader of the search, Nathaniel Hardcastle of the Trinity Bay Constabulary, recorded something odd in his report. The camp bore no marks of conflict, no trace of animal attack, no hint of a hurried escape. Yet deep slashes scarred several nearby trees, carved by something sharp and intentional, almost like boundary marks. What Hardcastle couldn't know was that Drusilla had been watching his men from a ledge 200 yards above. She studied them as they carefully catalogued evidence that meant nothing, recorded clues that led nowhere, and finally retreated to their coastal haven with theories that explained nothing. Their failure brought her complete satisfaction. The mountains had taken another surveyor, and autumn was only beginning. But as October's frost slid into the valleys, troubling whispers reached Trinity Bay through traders and trappers. Gainsworth had not been the lone traveler to disappear in the highlands that season. 2 fur merchants, a Methodist preacher, and a geological scout had all entered the passes within weeks. None returned. What linked these vanishings was not instantly clear to colonial officers, tangled in partial accounts and conflicting witness claims. They never could have guessed that their vanished men had faced something far more lethal than bears or treacherous ground. A hunter who understood that the secret to flawless pursuit wasn't strength or swiftness, but endless patience and intimate knowledge of the land. How long can society dismiss what it refuses to grasp? And what occurs when the wilderness decides to strike back? Winter crept toward the Appalachian highlands, and Drusilla Pembroke had already begun enlarging her range. Before we sink deeper into these mountain vanishings, leave a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. If this tale is keeping you awake beyond bedtime, tap that like button and subscribe, because the truth of what unfolded in these peaks only grows darker from here. The crack of shattering bone rang through Reverend Sybil Renford's final prayers. Her hymnal lay open to page 27, blood-soaked and abandoned in the morning frost. What followed next would force an entire colonial government to face the notion that some evil could not be bound by church creed or civil statute. Trinity Bay's Methody, St. Chapel reeked of whale oil and despair on the morning of October the 10th, 1829, when Constable Nathaniel Hardcastle delivered news that shattered whatever illusion of safety the coastal village had clung to. The wooden benches moaned under the weight of anxious parishioners, while outside, harbor seals cried warnings from ice-slick rocks. Inside, the taste of dread was as tangible as the brine-laden air that seeped through every crack in the chapel's hastily built frame. Reverend Renford had disappeared 6 days earlier while conducting missionary duties among the scattered farmsteads bordering the mountain paths. Unlike the mapmaker Gainsworth, whose loss might be blamed on the inherent hazards of wilderness surveying, Renford's absence represented something worse, the collapse of moral authority in a land that desperately required guidance. Her assignment had been straightforward: deliver communion supplies to remote families before the winter freeze rendered mountain passage impossible. The Appalachian communities, settled mostly by American émigrés fleeing political unrest, maintained only the faintest bond to colonial religious life. Renford's monthly visits served as their sole lifeline to organized Christianity, bringing tidings from the coast along with sacramental wine and carefully wrapped communion bread. From the Trinity Bay Methodist Records, October 4th, 1829, Reverend S. Renford set out at dawn with supplies for 7 households. Expected return, October 8th. Horse rested, weather favorable. Yet Renford's path carried her straight into ground that Drusilla Pembroke had begun regarding as her private domain. The Reverend's first 3 visits passed without trouble. The Coldwell family accepted their communion goods with gratitude, as did the Blackwells and the remote shack of aged Ebenezer Thornfield. Each cabin voiced the same reports. Game had grown scarce. Eerie sounds echoed across the valleys at night, and more than one family had stumbled upon elaborate snares near their clearings, far too sophisticated for local trappers. Renford noted these concerns in her journal, dismissing them as the natural anxiety that accompanied autumn's arrival in backwoods settlements. What she failed to realize was that each household she visited had already been under surveillance for weeks, their patterns catalogued, their weaknesses studied, assessed by one who knew that information was the deadliest instrument in any predator's kit. The Reverend's 4th visit to the remote farm of Augusta Pennington would become her last. Pennington lived alone in a meadow that required 3 hours of difficult riding to reach. Her cabin stood where 2 deer tracks converged beside a natural spring. A widow whose husband had perished in a logging mishap 2 years earlier, she had chosen solitude over the uncertain mercy of town living. Her small holding marked the outermost line of Methodist ministry, the final beacon before the mountains consumed all signs of settlement. When Renford reached her on October the 5th, she found Pennington in a state of barely restrained terror. "She's been watching," the widow whispered, pointing toward the tree line pressing in tight around her clearing. "3 nights straight. I've seen her slip among the pines, never in the same place twice, never a sound, but always there." Renford attempted to offer rational comforts: wild animals, perhaps a lost traveler, tricks of lamplight and shadow. Yet Pennington's description contained details that defied such reassurance. The watcher was certainly female, certainly human, and moved with an unnatural mastery of how to stay unseen while making her presence undeniable. Death was already reshaping the highlands. Even more chilling, Pennington had uncovered signs of deliberate sabotage around her cabin. Tool handles subtly loosened so they would break at critical tasks. Her well rope deliberately frayed so it would snap under weight. Even the hinges on her cabin's door had been meddled with, altered so they would shriek at the slightest shift, announcing her position to anyone listening in the night. "Someone wants me gone," Pennington explained, "but they want me gone in fear." Renford spent that night in Pennington's home, offering prayers and trying to steady the widow's shaken faith. Her journal note from October 5th reveals mounting unease. Mrs. P's worries seemed justified. Saw odd light movements in forest past midnight. No natural cause readily visible. What Renford couldn't have realized was that Drusilla Pembroke had been experimenting with new forms of psychological strain, sharpening methods that would drive lonely settlers to desert their claims without direct confrontation. Fear, when applied correctly, could empty land faster than violence while leaving no trace for colonial officers to examine. But the missionary's presence interfered with Drusilla's careful designs. A Methodist preacher symbolized outside authority, someone whose absence would spark organized searches and unwelcome attention. Unlike missing surveyors or merchants, a vanished clergyman would demand answers the colonial office could not ignore. Drusilla now faced a decision: relinquish her expanding domain or escalate to tactics that allowed no subtlety. She chose escalation. Renford's horse was located October 7th grazing calmly near Pennington Spring. The animal bore no distress, its tack fastened, saddlebags still filled with communion stores. Yet Reverend Renford herself had simply disappeared, as though she had stepped down for a moment and forgotten to exist. Pennington's version of that final dawn contained contradictions that plagued investigators. She insisted the minister had ridden out at sunrise exactly as planned, but couldn't explain why the horse returned riderless. She swore she heard ordinary sounds of departure, hoofbeats, the preacher's voice offering a last blessing, yet admitted she hadn't truly seen Renford leave the clearing. The widow's recollection, it seemed, had been carefully edited. What truly happened in those dim hours remained Drusilla Pembroke's secret, tucked away with her growing skill in witness control and the shaping of evidence. But the missionary's disappearance marked a vital shift in the mountain predator's method, a move from chance hunting to structured territorial expansion. How do you stalk someone whose absence will not go unnoticed? And what occurs when even God's envoys are unsafe in the wilds? By late October, 3 more farmsteads had been mysteriously left behind. Families fled to the coast with tales too frightening to believe. The brass buttons on Officer Merchant's coat reflected firelight as he studied the map spread over Trinity Bay's courthouse table. Red pins marked 7 vanishings in 6 weeks, too many for coincidence, too few for hysteria. The colonial regime was about to discover that some riddles grow more lethal the further you dig. November winds screamed through Trinity Bay's narrow lanes on the 15th, carrying the reek of smoke and the taste of winter sliding down from the Appalachian highlands. Inside the courthouse, a hastily called emergency meeting gathered every available authority from the Avalon Peninsula: magistrates, constables, military men, and one uneasy special commissioner sent from St. John's to address what the governor's staff had begun naming the mountain problem. Commissioner Merchant had earned his reputation solving crises that embarrassed the administration. A former Army investigator with service in America's frontier zones, he knew wilderness hazards and the mindset of cut-off communities. What he did not understand was how 7 fit adults could vanish from an area smaller than most English counties without leaving any tracks for seasoned scouts to follow. The courthouse's main chamber reeked of damp wool and nervous sweat as Merchant spoke before the gathered officials. Outside, sleet rattled windows facing Trinity Bay's grey harbour, where fishing craft swayed at anchor, their crews reluctant to venture inland for winter stores. The scrape of wooden hulls against pilings gave a grim rhythm to discussions that would reshape Newfoundland's frontier policy. "Gentlemen," Merchant began, consulting notes drafted in crisp military hand, "we face conditions that defy standard inquiry. 7 disappearances verified, 5 others still under review, and a pattern suggesting either coordinated criminal activity or," he hesitated, choosing words with care, "or influences beyond current comprehension." Constable Hardcastle delivered the official account, his voice carrying the exhaustion 6 weeks of failed searching had etched deep into him. The mapmaker Gainsworth had disappeared September 30th, Reverend Renford gone October 5th. 2 fur traders, Horatio Coldwell and Verity Blackwell, entered the ridges October 12th and never came back. A geological prospector named Millicent Waverley had last been spotted October 20th near the headwaters of Trinity River, but the cases that disturbed Merchant most involved whole families. The Thornfield homestead had been deserted sometime in the 3rd week of October. Discovered vacant by neighbors who came to check on aging Ebenezer Thornfield and his 2 adult sons. Their dwelling revealed no evidence of struggle, no hint of hurried flight, no clue where 3 generations of mountain farmers had vanished. Food remained on the table, half-eaten and crusted with frost. Livestock roamed their yard, unfed yet unharmed. Most chilling of all, the Thornfield family Bible sat open on the kitchen table to the book of Revelation 6:8. And I looked, and behold a pale horse, and the name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. Someone had drawn a line beneath the verse in fresh ink. The Taines were writing new lessons. Similar findings awaited investigators at the Waverley homestead, abandoned around the same period under equally mysterious conditions. Possessions remained untouched, costly goods left behind, yet the family themselves had simply ceased to exist. Their neighbors, the Penningtons, reported witnessing strange lights weaving through the forest in the weeks before both households disappeared. Not lanterns or campfires, but something drifting among the trees with deliberate intent. Merchant's military training had taught him to search for repeating patterns that revealed enemy tactics, and the evidence pointed toward a skilled adversary who understood psychological warfare. The deserted cabins weren't random strikes, but carefully chosen pressure points crafted to unsettle the entire frontier settlement chain. Someone was methodically driving settlers away from land they meant to claim for themselves. But who held such intimate awareness of terrain, family habits, and community ties? The commissioner's inquiry exposed unsettling gaps in colonial records concerning the mountain district's earliest inhabitants. Immigration logs tracked families arriving through St. Pat's and other coastal entries, yet the Appalachian hollows had also lured fugitives who entered Newfoundland outside official notice. American colonists fleeing political threats, displaced Acadian families, even ex-soldiers seeking seclusion after brutal campaigns. Among these unofficial residents, one name surfaced repeatedly in broken records and second-hand stories: Pembroke. A trapper named Samuel Brewster, questioned November 20th at Trinity Bay's Tavern, gave the clearest description available. "Drusilla Pembroke's been in those ridges longer than anyone recalls," he explained, nervous fingers curling around a pewter mug of rum. Her kin came up from the Carolinas maybe 20 years back after trouble with Cherokee raids. She was barely grown then, but already knew the woods like they had taught her everything worth knowing. Brewster's statement carried details that made Merchant take exact notes. Drusilla lived alone in a lodge so perfectly hidden that even seasoned hunters struggled to locate it twice. She bartered occasionally in remote outposts, trading furs and preserved meat for essentials, but never revealed her dwelling or lingered long enough for real conversation. More importantly, she possessed abilities beyond what any settler should have gained from common frontier life. "She moves through timber like smoke," Brewster whispered, glancing toward the tavern windows as though expecting watchers. "Can follow tracks through ground where others see nothing but stones and thorns. Some claim she learned hunting craft from natives before they traveled west. Others insist she uncovered things on her own that no person ought to know." The trapper's account included one detail that especially interested Merchant: Drusilla's strange knack for foreseeing when strangers would intrude upon her domain, sometimes placing herself along their paths days before they appeared. Such foresight implied either uncanny senses or a wide web of informants, both possibilities that defied normal policing. But Brewster's most alarming admission described recent shifts in Drusilla's conduct. "She used to keep clear, avoided talking with settlement folk," he said. "But this year's different. She's been asking who's coming and going, which families live where, what trails the government men use for surveys. Like she's planning something that needs her to know everybody's business." Merchant closed his ledger slowly, realizing his investigation had uncovered a suspect who possessed every advantage on her ground. Drusilla Pembroke mastered the Highlands completely, while colonial officers struggled to move through country that could conceal entire armies. She grasped the psychology of lonely settlers while the Gotin Vermont forced coastal thinking on mountain problems. Most critically, she had apparently chosen that coexistence was no longer an option. How do you capture someone who can vanish into lands that charts refuse to mark? And what unfolds when pursuit transforms into outright war? Winter had begun sealing the mountain crossings, yet Commissioner Marchant had already determined that spring would deliver a reckoning. Steam curled upward from Commissioner Moran's mug as he watched 12 armed men prepare for a pursuit that might claim half their lives. The flavor of mountain mist already carried hints of bloodshed. This mission would either end Drusilla Pembroke's dominion of fear or reveal that some hunters can't be bound by the laws of civilization. That year, ice shattered early upon Trinity River, filling the valley with echoes like faraway artillery as winter's grasp loosened across the Appalachian ridges. By April 15, 1830, colonial officials had mustered the greatest pursuit in Newfoundland's recorded annals. 12 constables, 6 military auxiliaries, 2 Mi'kmaq trackers, and Commissioner Marchant himself, each provisioned for extended campaigns through wilderness. The official order seemed straightforward: locate and seize Drusilla Pembroke for questioning concerning multiple vanishings. The truth promised to be far more tangled. Marchant had passed the cold months studying every possible report of the mountain recluse, piecing together a profile that resembled folklore more than police files. Drusilla Pembroke, around 40 years of age, measured nearly 6 feet tall with the lean frame of one who had endured decades in untamed country. Her hair, turned prematurely silver, was said by locals to make her vanish against granite cliffs and snow-draped firs. But appearances counted less than her proven abilities. Witnesses swore Drusilla could track quarry across terrain that baffled seasoned hunters, gliding through forests without leaving sound or trace. She grasped weather shifts well enough to foresee storms days in advance, knowledge that let her take advantage while others scrambled for shelter. Most troubling of all, she appeared to carry an eerie knack for anticipating human intent, materializing along travel routes as though she had read decisions before they were made. From the Trinity Bay Constabulary files, April 10, 1830. Subject demonstrates extraordinary wilderness aptitude consistent with extended isolation training. Recommend armed approach with utmost caution. The unit set out from Trinity Bay on April 20th, following the inland trail that had swallowed countless wanderers before them. Marchant's plan depended on numbers and coordination, using Mi'kmaq trackers to read signs invisible to European eyes, while enforcing constant communication to prevent lone ambushes. What he hadn't foreseen was how completely Drusilla had laid groundwork for just such an encounter. The opening day passed quietly, the column making swift progress along known paths where lumber roads still carved clear access toward the mountains. Yet once they pressed beyond the last outlying farms, subtle signals began to surface, warning that they had entered shaped terrain. Game paths had been altered to funnel travelers into chosen passages. Natural markers had been shifted in ways that distorted bearings. Even fallen timber appeared arranged to herd movement along hidden routes. Constable James Wicklow, long hardened by frontier patrols, remarked in his journal, "Country looks ordinary, but feels designed. Believe we are being steered rather than wandering." By the second nightfall, the party had set camp near the deserted Thornfield property, using its silent cabin as headquarters for systematic sweeps. The houses inside remained just as investigators had first uncovered it months before, personal effects untouched, a family Bible open to revelation, and no clue as to where 3 generations of settlers had vanished. That night, the hunters discovered their own presence had been marked. Sentries reported eerie sounds threading through the trees encircling their boundary. Not the stirrings of animals, but deliberate pacing that looped around them without stepping near enough for sight. Twice, night guards believed they glimpsed the tall figure of a watcher beyond the tree line, though every pursuit yielded only disturbed needles and faint traces of wood smoke drifting from no known source. The mountains remembered every tread. At first light, Prince confirmed someone had prowled the camp during guard rotation, circling in patterns that displayed precise awareness of sentry schedules and blind spots. More disturbing still, several horses bore evidence of close inspection. Bridles fingered, cinches tested, supply bags unfastened and refastened with care that suggested calculated study rather than common theft. She was observing. Marchant realized with unease as he studied the tracks. She was learning their abilities, probing their defenses, preparing her counter. The Mi'kmaq trackers, brothers Joseph and Matthew Kopp, offered insights that made the discovery even darker. These prints belonged to someone moving through the forest with skills far beyond normal wilderness training. Someone who knew hunting methods more advanced than simple survival tricks. The boot marks revealed alterations, leather soles cut in patterns meant for quiet passage across varied terrain, heels worn down in ways that betrayed long practice stalking prey. "This woman hunts men the way others hunt moose," Joseph Kopp murmured. "She knows we are present before we ever sense her watching." On the expedition's third day, they came face to face with Drusilla's grim work. Following a game trail toward the suspected cabin site, the party entered a clearing filled with signs of systematic butchery. Multiple fire pits arranged with care for different cooking styles, wooden racks for smoking meat set to catch prevailing winds. Stone slabs shaped into cutting tables, their surfaces stained dark from repeated use. But the most unsettling discovery lay half-buried under ash and bone shards, personal belongings carefully sorted and preserved, leather pouches, metal buckles, wooden combs, bone buttons, objects telling quiet stories of lives ended, then catalogued. Among them, Constable Hardcastle recognized a brass surveyor's compass once owned by Leopold Gainsworth, the cartographer who vanished the prior September. Nearby sat Reverend Renford's pocket watch. Its glass cracked, yet the mechanism still worked. Marchant studied the arrangement with horror growing in his chest. They had uncovered more than a crime scene. This was a workshop, a place where Drusilla refined her craft, processing her victims with precise efficiency. The belongings weren't trophies, but resources, metal that could be reforged, leather still useful, bone and antler with practical wilderness purposes. "She's been hunting humans for years," Marchant whispered to Hardcastle. "We're not chasing a murderer who picked this land at random. We're after someone who sees people as a renewable supply." That night, the party camped in a fortified position overlooking the clearing. Guards rotated every 2 hours, vigilance unbroken against an enemy who held every tactical advantage in her wilderness domain. They had proof of her presence, but Drusilla herself remained as elusive as mountain fog. What they didn't realize was that she had watched them uncover her workshop, gauged their reactions, and was already planning her reply to their intrusion. How do you hunt someone who treats your entire expedition as target practice? And what happens when the predator stops observing and begins eliminating? Day 4 would reveal the answers, though half the men wouldn't live to remember them. Constable Wicklow's scream tore through their morning mist like a blade through silk. When silence fell, only 11 men remained to chase the woman who had already turned her hunt upon them. They were about to learn that in Drusilla Pembroke's mountains, outsiders never chose when the game started or ended. Dawn of April 24th broke grey and bitter over the Appalachian peaks. Fog lay so heavy it smothered sound and twisted familiar shapes into threatening silhouettes. Commissioner Marchant positioned his men in a tight defensive ring around the camp, assigning every constable a sector to stop the surprise approaches that plagued previous nights. But Drusilla Pembroke had spent 20 years perfecting ways to make such defenses meaningless. The assault began before anyone knew it had started. Wicklow manned the eastern watch, posted where a granite ridge overlooked the slope to Trinity River. His orders were simple. Keep line of sight with the next sentry, report any movement or odd sounds, and rotate shifts every 2 hours to prevent fatigue. But those orders couldn't prepare for an enemy who flowed through terrain like water around stone. An opponent who knew exactly how to approach a soldier without triggering the instincts that kept frontier lawmen alive. The first sign of trouble wasn't from Wicklow's post, but from the silence of his missing hourly signal, a coded whistle that confirmed alertness. When 15 minutes passed with no reply, Sergeant Morrison moved to check. Following the cautious approach methods Marchant drilled into them, he reached the position. It was empty. Wicklow's rifle leaned against the granite outcrop exactly in place, powder horn and shot pouch untouched. Telescope still extended toward the valley. Everything suggested a man who had stepped away briefly, perhaps to relieve himself, perhaps chasing a sound. But Wicklow himself was gone, vanished as if the mist had swallowed him whole. Morrison's cry jolted the entire expedition into sharp readiness. Weapons drawn, formation firm, they combed the immediate surroundings with method, searching for prints, blood, hints of struggle, any clue as to what had become of their missing companion. The MCMA trackers, Joseph and Matthew Kopp, uncovered signs that made the situation far more grim. Wicklow's boots had left distinct marks in the soft ground near his last known place, yet the trail told a tale that defied common reason. The prints displayed ordinary walking patterns for nearly half an hour, then stopped suddenly mid-step. No traces of another figure drawing near, no mark of a fight or sudden dash, only footprints that ended as though their owner had been lifted straight into the air. "Impossible," March murmured, crouching to examine the evidence himself. "Men do not simply vanish without a trace." But Matthew Kopp gestured toward the tree line where faint disruptions in the brush hinted at a different cause. Someone with remarkable skill had come upon Wicklow's location from higher ground, moving through terrain so harsh that regular tracking skills failed to reveal the passage. The route of approach made such effective use of natural cover that an observer would remain unseen until the very final instant of contact. Death had stalked with practiced precision. Just 20 yards past Wicklow's deserted post, Joseph Kopp noticed the first hint of what had taken place. A shallow hollow in the pine needles, roughly the size and outline of a kneeling human, positioned exactly where an archer might steady aim at the sentry post. No arrows were left behind, no obvious weapons dropped, but the indentation suggested someone had crouched patiently, awaiting the perfect instant to strike. She studied him, Kopp explained softly, learned his movements, planned her approach, chose her time. The hunt for more signs revealed darker discoveries, snapped pine branches arranged in faint patterns meant to direct pursuit in chosen directions, disturbed soil hinting at fresh diggy. Nang and careful concealment, most chilling a chain of small cairns, stacked stones placed at regular spaces pointing deeper into the highlands. As though marking a path Drusilla intended them to follow, Marchant now faced a choice that would decide the mission's fate. They could withdraw to Trinity Bay, report Wicklow's vanishing, and request a larger force with stronger equipment and greater numbers. Or they could chase their adversary into land that clearly offered her every tactical advantage, risking more losses, yet holding on to the initiative they had fought months to achieve. The commissioner chose the chase, reasoning that Drusilla's daring showed desperation rather than confidence. A truly secure predator would never gamble on open confrontation with armed authority, but one feeling cornered might make errors seasoned hunters could exploit. The company pressed deeper into the mountains, following the marked trail with weapons ready and senses straining for ambush. The path wound into ever harder terrain. Narrow cuts between granite cliffs, stream crossings demanding single-file passage, thick brush that shrank vision to only a few yards. Every step carried them farther from ground they knew and deeper into country where their opponent possessed every possible edge. By late day, they uncovered signs that Wicklow was not Drusilla's only victim that morning. A mile past the confrontation site, the party found remnants of a makeshift camp, deserted in apparent haste. Gear scattered across a clearing, cold ash from a fire doused quickly, and tracks pointing northeast in hurried flight. Yet among the abandoned supplies, Constable Hardcastle recognized belongings from earlier expedition members, personal items of missing travelers arranged as though on display, Leupold Gainsworth's survey tools refitted for new purposes, Reverend Renford's Bible, certain verses marked in what looked like dried blood. Most harrowing, a spread of scalping blades laid in deliberate patterns around a central hearth, still faintly warm. She has been preparing for this clash, Marchant realized, eyeing the deserted camp with growing dread, each object placed with intent to send particular messages. But what message was Drusilla truly sending? The reply came as twilight fell and the expedition fortified a camp on a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. As sentries took their stations and cooking fires were kindled, a sound rolled across the peaks that made every man clutch his weapon. A long, sorrowful howl, part human, part beast, entirely unnatural. The cry came again 3 times, each call rising from a different quarter, suggesting more than one voice, or else a figure of extraordinary movement. Between the howls, another sound emerged. Wicklow's voice, pleading for help, drifting from the blackness beyond their perimeter. Marchant commanded the men to hold their ground, knowing that Drusilla was using their missing ally as bait for further assaults. Yet Wicklow's screams became increasingly frantic, more tortured, until holding formation demanded every shred of discipline the expedition still carried. How long can trained soldiers endure hearing a companion in torment without casting aside tactical judgment? And what occurs when mercy itself turns into a weapon in an enemy's grasp? The night was about to reveal that certain hunts conclude only once the final hunter collapses. Wicklow's last cry tore through the mountain silence exactly as Sergeant Morrison's throat split beneath Drusilla's blade. 2 already fallen, 9 remaining, and the darkness was merely awakening. The expedition was discovering that certain predators reserve their deadliest skills for after nightfall. The strike came at 11:47 p.m., precisely when human vigilance sinks to its lowest ebb during rotating watch. Commissioner Marchant had arranged his surviving men in overlapping zones of fire, each guard supporting another in a pattern meant to stop isolated targeting. But Drusilla Pembroke had invested decades honing tactics that twisted such defenses into exploitable weaknesses. The first clue their perimeter was pierced came not from watchmen but from their horses, whose sudden panic betrayed something dangerous moving just beyond the reach of firelight. The beasts stamped and whinnied with unease, straining against their restraints in a way seasoned frontiersmen instantly knew as predator fear. But when the sentries went to probe the disturbance, they discovered nothing but shadows and the suffocating sensation of being tracked by something aware of their every motion. Drusilla had slipped into their camp with methods bordering on the unnatural, shifting with the patience of stone and the silence of drifting snow. She drew near during the evening's shift change, synchronizing her crawl with those fleeting instants when the guard's focus turned inward rather than outward. Her path exploited every hollow in the terrain, each shadow, every oversight their fortifications had unknowingly left behind. The Mi'kmaq tracker, Joseph Kopp, later testified to finding signs of her approach. She moved like flowing water, seeking fractures in stone, each step deliberate, every gesture calculated to pass unseen. Yet Drusilla's infiltration had goals beyond murder alone. She spent the earlier hours observing her prey, noting their individual patterns and isolating pressure points for psychological exploitation during sustained mental warfare. Some responded firmly to direct threats, others unraveled when danger was uncertain. Some held their discipline under duress, while others broke once separated from collective support. Recognizing these patterns allowed her to craft attacks tailored for maximum collapse of morale and tactical unity. Wicklow's agonized cries had been a phase of this psychological conditioning designed to stretch discipline thin and expose which men might abandon order for rescue attempts. When none reacted to his apparent suffering, Drusilla reshaped her methods instantly, realizing these foes possessed training strong enough to resist emotional ploys. The mountains whispered patience and exactness. Morrison's fall came first, silent and surgical, as Drusilla reached his post while fog and blackness cloaked her movements perfectly. The sergeant never glimpsed his executioner, never had chance to sound alarm or mount defense. One moment he guarded the eastern trail, the next his body cooled in pine needles while his blood seeped into soil already familiar with sacrifice. His absence might have gone unnoticed for hours had she not positioned the corpse with precision. Drusilla laid Morrison's remains where discovery was inevitable, understanding that a mutilated comrade shatters morale more swiftly than a simple vanishing. The sheer psychological weight of visual evidence, the clean slices, the systematic stripping of gear, the ritualistic arrangement furthered her mission more than mere death could. Constable Davies stumbled upon Morrison's remains at midnight while checking positions. His horrified cry rang across the camp, awakening all to their breached security. The survivors huddled into a compact defensive ring, weapons raised, while Marchant struggled to steady men who were realizing their adversary possessed powers beyond mortal bounds. "She's inside our lines," Marchant declared grimly. "From now on, nobody moves alone, no one leaves sight of the group, and none of us assumes safety until sunrise." Yet dawn was still 6 hours distant, and Drusilla had only begun to reveal her arsenal. The next strike crippled their communications, cutting away the expedition's capacity to coordinate against scattered assaults, with throwing knives hurled with a mastery that betrayed endless training. She eliminated sentries in positions where their sudden deaths would rupture defenses with the widest possible gaps. Defensive watch, each execution was timed with precision, preventing victims from sounding alarms while simultaneously forcing survivors to reposition in ways that exposed new weaknesses. Officers Bradley and Henley fell within minutes of each other. Their throats were opened by blades hurled from angles that seemed impossible given the terrain and limited cover. In both incidents, the weapons struck with such force that they pierced leather and flesh, maintaining deadly accuracy across distances that challenged expert gunmen. The party's defensive ring crumbled as survivors withdrew toward their central fire, abandoning the outer posts that had transformed into traps of death instead of protective stations. 7 men remained active, clustered together in a space scarcely 20 feet wide, while something circled them in the dark with the relentlessness of a wolf pack, but the cunning of a trained commander. Matthew Kopp, the last Micmac tracker, offered insights that made their situation far more dreadful. "She is not hunting for food or territory," he warned. "This is war. Her intent is to wipe out every threat within her realm." Drusilla's methods had grown beyond simple predation. They had become territorial cleansing, a campaign crafted to drive colonial intrusion from her mountain citadel permanently. The expedition stood as the most formidable test of her dominance that government forces had ever attempted, and her counterstrike revealed abilities suggesting years of preparation for exactly such a clash. At 2:15 a.m., she executed her boldest strike yet. A flaming arrow tore into the expedition's supply cache, igniting gunpowder and rations in a detonation that lit the surrounding forest for hundreds of yards. In that fleeting flare, the survivors caught their first clear sight of their hunter, a tall silhouette gliding between trees with liquid motion, carrying a recurved bow and dressed in garb crafted to vanish into shadow and bark. But the blast carried purposes beyond psychological fear. It destroyed the bulk of their ammunition, food, and medicine, ensuring that any who lived would face a harrowing retreat through hostile land with no supplies. More crucially, it proved Drusilla could strike their strongest defenses whenever she wished. The message was direct: surrender or perish. Commissioner Marchant studied the remaining men in the wavering light of burning debris, realizing they faced an adversary whose skills eclipsed anything in his military record. 7 constables, 1 tracker, and himself, 9 men, against a woman who seemed to wield otherworldly powers and intimate mastery of terrain no map could depict. How do you combat an enemy who twists your strengths into fatal flaws? And what happens when escape itself becomes impossible in land wholly commanded by your foe? The final hours before sunrise would decide whether any of the party lived to recount what they had uncovered in the Appalachian heights. Marchant's pistol shook as Drusilla Pembroke stepped into the fire's glow, her silver hair glistening like frost upon stone. 20 years of hunting humans had sculpted something inhuman from bone and flesh. The moment had come when the law of civilization would meet the mountain's oldest justice. Dawn brought no comfort for the survivors, only the grim realization that their night of terror had been an orchestrated prologue to the true confrontation. As pale light filtered through the pine canopy, exposing the wreckage of their defenses, the 8 remaining men stood face to face with their tormentor for the first time since the pursuit began. Drusilla emerged from the mist as though the mountain itself had shaped her, moving with a fluid grace that defied natural human motion. Nearly 6 feet tall, lean as a starving wolf, she wore attire blending frontier gear with modifications reflecting decades spent refining hunting techniques. Her silver hair was interlaced with tiny bones, finger joints, teeth, fragments that whispered of past hunts, yet it was her eyes that unsettled most. Not madness, not animal frenzy, but cold intellect that sized each expedition member with the detachment of a butcher evaluating livestock. "Gentlemen," she spoke, her voice carrying the cultured lilt of colonial gentry laced with something harder, more primal. "You have traveled far to reach my dwelling. I trust the accommodations have been instructive." Commissioner Marchant stepped forward, hand firm on his pistol grip. Though both understood firearms meant little here, he declared, "Drusilla Pembroke, by authority of His Majesty's colonial government, you are under arrest for the murders of Leopold Gainsworth, Reverend Cyril Renford, and numerous other victims." Drusilla's smile revealed teeth filed to sharp points, an alteration serving both practical and psychological effect in close combat. "Murder?" she asked, genuinely baffled. "Commissioner, you misread what has transpired in these peaks. I am no criminal breaking your statutes. I am natural law itself, functioning as nature designed." Her words revealed a philosophy that chilled the expedition more than any threat of violence ever could. Mountains had imparted different lessons. For 2 decades, Drusilla had lived by codes older than colonial legislation, Christian ethics, or refined ideas of human rights. She regarded the Appalachian ridges as her dominion, earned through decades of endurance under conditions that destroyed weaker souls. Anyone stepping into her land without sanction meant intrusion, and intrusions demanded removal by methods that proved sharper adaptation to nature's trials. Every man who vanished in these ranges perished because he presumed control over ground that was never his to seize, she declared, circling the party's defensive camp with predatory calm. Surveyors carving property lines through her hunting trails, missionaries preaching redemption to households who had endured perfectly without European guidance, traders pulling wealth from lands they had no right to exploit. Matthew Kopp, the Mi'kmaq scout, grasped her reasoning in ways his colonial peers could not. "She speaks as the elder warriors once did," he murmured to Marchant. "Land gained through blood, held with superior knowledge, guarded by strength that proves worth." Yet Drusilla's territorial stance stretched beyond survivalist creed into something darker and deliberate. She had turned 20 square miles of wild into a complex killing ground, engineered to erase colonial presence without leaving trails for investigators. Each disappearance was designed to resemble mishap, accident, or desertion. Families left rather than died, giving the illusion of voluntary removal instead of forced expulsion. "Your missing people," Drusilla explained, "fit distinct categories of challenge, each needing a distinct response. Wanderers could be dispatched directly, their fate blamed on wilderness dangers. Families required psychological force to drive them away. Officials demanded harsher proof of control. The expedition was discovering they faced not a lone killer, but a strategist who had spent 20 years refining asymmetric war against encroaching power. Marchant tried to keep formal procedure, though events had crossed far past normal enforcement. "Whatever your reasoning, you will yield and face colonial justice. Resistance will only—" Drusilla's laughter cut him off, a sound like wind through brittle trees, empty of humor. "Commissioner, you still cannot grasp the core truth. You are not carrying out an arrest in colonial land. You are intruding in my dominion, where I am judge, jury, and executioner." Her words carried more than menace, backed by proof. Having wiped out half their men without guns or standard support, the closing clash began not with blood, but with negotiation that exposed the true span of her designs. She had summoned colonial officials not from fear, but to deliver a warning that would halt incursions forever. "Take 3 of your men," she proposed, gesturing toward the shaken survivors. "Go back to Trinity Bay. Tell your superiors the Appalachians are forbidden to colonial growth. No maps, no towns, no resource taking. Respect these limits and your people may remain safe in the coastal lands where they belong." This was more than bargaining. It was an ultimatum upheld by 2 decades of proven ability to erase challengers. But Commissioner Merchant had not endured months of hardship to yield in the final moment. Raising his pistol with steady aim, he pointed at Drusilla's chest, knowing this encounter would decide whether Crown law pushed into the interior wilds or ended at the frontier of settlement. "The only message I'll return with," he said, "is that no one stands above the Crown's authority in Newfoundland." Drusilla inclined her head in approval, as if Merchant had finally spoken with honor. "Then we understand each other, Commissioner. This is war, and only one side will endure to tell it." What followed would be recalled differently by each survivor, their stories shaped by shock, disorder, and the mind's struggle to process moments that defied civilization's order against wilderness's law. How does a standoff close when both believe themselves right within their own justice? And what becomes of victory when it means choosing between law and survival? The mountains prepared to pass their final sentence on 20 years of conflict,